Hi, today is October 18, and we're in 106 in the library. And Ms. Virginia Braithwaite is going to talk about lesson planning, so I'm going to put this over. And Whitney, this is for you and for everybody else. So Ms. Braithwaite, thanks for coming, and I'm turning this over to you.
Okay, thank you.
Pleasure, thanks for coming.
All right, so I know some of you are in 330, which is the basic lesson plan class where you're learning about lesson plans. And some of you are in your second semester of level 1, having gone through lesson planning and assessment already. And then I know there's some of you that are in your third semester getting ready to go out to student teach, and you've done a number of lesson plans throughout the semesters. And you all are aware that we used to do UBD, Understanding by Design, and this semester is the first semester that we've switched to the Danielson Framework so that everything aligns with evaluations and things like that. So before we begin, I want to know how many of you have a copy of the Danielson Smart Card. Everybody? It looks, if you don't know exactly what it looks like this. Have you seen anything like this? Okay. Well, if you don't, wait, let me just.
I'm going to say, can I pass those out?
Yeah, just, here you go.
Thank you. These are. Thank
Yeah.
you.
And those of you that don't have one with you right now, let me just let you,
Thank you.
and you can give Dr. Smiley the extra copies when you're done.
Good. And can I pass this out to you?
I'm not ready for those
Okay,
yet.
all right. Okay. Thank you.
So before we begin talking about how to do a lesson plan and what needs to be in a lesson plan and what are good lesson plans and where do you go to get the information, let's just talk about this framework. So Charlotte Danielson did this research, and she's been adding to the research since before 2007. And so what she has done is looked at teaching and said, okay, if we need to kind of play a game and section out what teachers do, how do we do that? And the way that we do that, according to Danielson, is it goes into 4 different domains. And the way that this works, and don't ask me why she did it, except it goes in a circle, is it starts with planning and preparation is domain 1, the classroom environment is domain 2, instruction is domain 3, and then professional responsibilities are domain 4. Now this is not linear. It moves back and forth. Okay, so you could be in planning and then go to instruction and then go back to classroom environment and then go to professional responsibilities and go back to planning again. So it just moves as a teacher needs to move. The best way to describe this when you're looking at it is to say planning and instruction is what occurs behind the scenes. You're home, you're in your classroom, kids aren't there, they're not really inputting into this very much, and you plan everything out. That's where you develop your lesson plan. Classroom environment and instruction is what's happening now in the classroom with your children and doing what you do in the classroom as a teacher. Professional responsibilities kind of covers everything else. It fills in the gaps, because you're responsible in a number of ways as a teacher across all of the other domains. Does that make sense to you? Okay. So when let's go back now to lesson planning. So let's look at this preparation and planning section. Okay. So what does that mean to you? Well, you've got to understand the content. You got to know what you're going to teach. If you don't know what you're going to teach, how can you teach it? Okay? The next thing is knowing your students. If I didn't know my students, how can I plan for what they need and how I'm going to teach them? I've got to have that basis. So you have to build a relationship with your students. You can get a lot of information from their cum folders and things like that. But unless you know the student themselves, you really don't have the full value of it. So I could be looking at a student working in my classroom, and they may not be doing very well in my classroom, and I could say, okay, well, yeah, they're just not a very good student. But then if I sit there and talk to them and they talk to me, I can find out things, and I can say, oh, well, there's other things. It's not that they're not doing what they're supposed to. This other stuff is going on, and how can they concentrate on schoolwork if this is going on? And it could be they don't have breakfast, they didn't sleep well the night before, they're not feeling good, they've got something going on in their home. I mean, it could be a lot of different variables. But unless you know that, you're kind of looking at them with blinders on. And so you've got to know the whole student. Okay. The next one is you've got to know where to go to get your instructional outcomes. Your instructional outcomes is what do you want them to be able to do? What do you want them to be able to do after you teach them, and how are you going to get them to demonstrate it? Okay. Next one, resources. If you don't know the resources that you have available to you, okay, you decide to do a coloring unit with your class. You're going to do an activity, and then you go into your closet and you don't have the crayons. Well, you can't do that activity. In the lesson, you got to restructure your lesson. Okay, it's as simple as that. It could be more intricate than that. I mean, it just runs the whole gamut. Coherent instruction. So that is, do you know how you're going to do a scope and sequence so that you begin and you end and it makes sense? And those of you that have done lesson plans already, how many times have you had at least a minimal amount of problems with making sure that it flows? The question is, how does it flow? Does it move one thing into another and it's smooth? Or is there a gap in something because you left out a part of the lesson plan? And then the last one is designing your assessment. And that, even though you take a separate course on assessment, a lot of times in some universities and colleges, assessment and curriculum go together in the same class. You can't do one without knowing about the other. So your assessment is, how are you going to judge whether those students know what they're supposed to know at the end of the lesson? Now, is feedback an assessment? Student feedback, is that an assessment? Yeah, it is. A test? If you are in PE, could skipping rope be an assessment? Yeah. So there's all kinds of different types of assessments. And what's the one thing that you've got to know about the assessments that goes back to the lesson plan itself? You've got to know who? The students. And a lot of times now, we used to, okay, we give them a test. They do well on the test, they know the stuff. If they don't do well on the test, we say they don't know the stuff. And then we have to go back and reteach. But that doesn't take into account student learning styles and the ability of the students to work in one area of that or another. So a lot of times now you have choices for assessments. You can draw a picture, you can write a story, you can sing a song, there's a lot of different things that you can do. You're not always limiting a student to just one thing. Sometimes you are, sometimes you have to, but you as a teacher have that option in your classroom to say, this is how I'm going to assess my students.
And you don't have to wait until it's through and give them a test to prove that it is.
No. And you should, throughout the entire lesson, be testing for understanding as you move forward. And if at any time during the lesson you realize that the students are having trouble understanding, you stop and you go back. You can't build on something that they don't have the knowledge of. Everything is sequential. And you have to sequence it. Okay? So, going with that, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this because I know that you all have had lesson planning and that you've all, or at least in it. Dr. Smiley gave me a list of questions. Yeah. Okay, so this is what I did. I went and gave you a fact sheet. So here's your answers, and there are some resources that answer them. Now, for some of you, you didn't have any questions because I know you've done lesson planning enough that for a student, you're about where you need to be. You know, there are some, maybe some questions, minimal questions, but as far as if I gave you a lesson plan and said develop one, you could do it. You know where to go, you know what to do. And so I just decided, though, that I would answer these questions by giving you these fact sheets.
Thank you very much. That's very thoughtful.
And there's one for you. So, where do I go? Find the Montana K-12 content standards. Do you need another one? Okay. All right, and that is the OPI site. Okay. The next one, and that just lists the standards.
Can I add something to that?
Yes, you can.
There's also an app that you can download for your phone that has all the standards.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Like NG something common, and then there's one with the science also.
And do you know how you can, I know that, I forgot, and I thank you, because I had it, and then somebody walked in, and I forgot it, and so I didn't get on here,
I
and
just
so.
know that that's my go-to. is that
Okay,
app, 'cause
but
it's
that's a
super
good one to
easy
have.
me.
Yeah, because it's,
Hmm? Yeah.
Tell me and I'll put it in.
yeah.
I just don't have my phone with me.
Yeah, that's
I have
fine.
it on my phone.
Send it to
want
me and
me
I'll
to-
put it into the announcements.
Thank you, Tara, because that any time that you can share resources like Tara just did, it is the best thing that you can do. Because instructors, we have a lot of information, but we are not as young as you all are. So we're not as tech lit as you are. And I mean, you know how to look and find stuff all over the place. And sometimes things come up that we may not even be aware of. I do know about the app because I do use an app similar to that when I do classroom observations. But it's nice to be able to just go on there. And I'll be honest with you, one of the reasons that it's really good to have instead of the OPI site has been upgraded. They have changed their entire, the way it looks, the way you have to go on there to find things. And the director of educator licensure told me the other day when we had a conversation about that. She says, well, Virginia, you know what? The search is your best friend on our site. That doesn't say a whole lot because nobody seems to be able to navigate it very easily. But I think it's because it's a new site and there's some links that aren't working and things like that on the site.
In the study questions too, that was due just this past week, there was a thing that walked them all the way through for lesson planning, and I got notes back from them saying they've already found some marvelous resources. And that's the way I'm going to do it because it was new to me also.
Yeah.
Mike Jetty said, well, good luck.
Yeah. And so as you find these things, if you just share it with one another, that makes a lot of difference in helping. But this is the general, when you click on that web page, what comes up is basically just a list of the grade levels and the subject areas. And so you can just click on what you need. The second one, what does well, let me go back. Let me go back. Let me add one more piece to this. So what I wanted to look at, because I knew they had it up there and I found it. So what I'm going to do is pass this out to you. This is a checklist for you of resources and lesson plans that are on the OPI website, videos, and K-12 common resources. No, I gave everybody one. So I have it separated into the specific subjects and then the link to that specific subject area and then what it contains. Some of them contain all the lesson plans, all the resources, And then the common resources for K-12, and then videos. Some of them, the cross-curriculum one, I think is new, and there's nothing up there yet. It's, anytime you click on it, it's dead. But if you have to do any kind of a lesson plan to incorporate IEFA, this would be a good source to go to for an area, and then you can find what you need. And Dr. Smiley, I'll send you these documents because I haven't saved them. I hope my computer doesn't go down before I get back, but that's okay.
Whitney tonight.
Okay, so the second question was, how does a teacher make a smooth transition from one subject to another during the school day? This takes practice, I'll be honest with you. It just takes practice. But in saying that, probably the best thing, I want you to think for just a minute. Go back to your school days, elementary and high school. Think about your classrooms when you had to make transitions. When was it smooth? What was it about those transitions that you think might have made for a smooth move from one thing to another?
Routine, knowing what to expect.
Routine. No, it's the student knowing what to expect. Okay? There's an established routine. The students know the routine. They're not surprised. It just goes on like clockwork. What else?
We sang a cleanup song when I was in elementary school, so we transitioned you into cleaning up, and then she tapped you in the head if you were done cleaning, and you could go sit down.
Okay, so we have a cue. There's a cue for a change. Anybody have where there was a little bell or some music playing? Okay, that's a cue. And when you hear that, you as a student knew what was going to happen. You didn't question it. You didn't stand there like deer in the headlights. You knew what was going to happen. Okay, so first of all, though, the teacher has to have a plan. What kind of routine am I going to establish, and what am I going to establish for certain things? So like in the morning, when they first come in to the classroom, there's a lot of hustle and bustle, depending on the grade level. What are you going to do? So you have to think that out. You have to know your students. Sometimes you have a routine that you think is going to work, and it doesn't work for the students in your class. It might have worked last year. Now you got a new group of students. It may not work as well for them. So sometimes you have to tweak what you're doing. Okay? I taught 9th grade for most of my teaching experience, and when they came in, they were very loud. So I finally got tired of telling them, you get quiet, be quiet. So I got one of those red light, green light, blue, the red light, green, and so I set it for the noise level, and I just stuck it there. And when it started, when it got up to yellow, they knew that they needed to calm down, and because we went through it, we made sure we understood what was going to happen. And of course, if it gets to red, as a teacher, you can set the buzzer, or it can just blink. I set the buzzer and it blinked. So every once in a while, especially if it was like a day we had a football game, they were coming in, they were wired. And so, I didn't have to keep telling them to be quiet. They knew when they saw that yellow light, it was time to quiet down. And, every once in a while it would get to the red because they were excited about something, but most of the time it would be taken care of by itself. So it depends on also the grade level, what you're doing. But even kindergartners can follow directions pretty well if they practice, and that's the key. You got to practice with them. You set them in the beginning of the school year, and then you keep practicing them all the time until they, after about 2 or 3 weeks, it'll be a habit, and they're pretty good. Every once in a while, you'll have to remind them, but most of the time, it works. So the other thing is during class time, the students need to be ready to end one thing and begin another. And like the song, singing that song gave you time to clean up and get ready to move on. It wasn't just, okay, now we're at the time we're going to move on. And students weren't ready. They weren't ready to clean up or whatever. By playing that song, they knew it was time to put things away, get things ready, and then they were going to move. Okay? The other thing is you need to be ready. If you're not ready, you don't have things prepared, you can get behind and transitions can stagger and kids are idle and you're going to start having a problem. One thing that I read one time about teacher preparation, which I thought was pretty good, is to make sure you use the little sticky notes and have those sticky notes in your books, in your textbooks and things, so you know exactly where you're going. And all you have to do is open up to those pages and you're ready to go. You don't have to spend the time trying to find the page or whatever. So anything that you can do pre-time before class starts to get yourself prepared to make an easy transition. You've got everything laid out, all the copies are in order. It makes for an easier transition for you as the teacher because you're ready to move. And then the last thing, they know their responsibilities, they don't have to ask questions, and they're not idle. If they get idle, you're going to have a problem. They're going to start talking. They're going to start singing. They're going to start moving about, getting up. So it all depends on just how well you plan for that transition. Okay? So those web pages that I gave you, there's some really good information about how to make that transition, a little bit more in-depth information. The Responsive Classroom is a really good website to use. I listed that one first. The other one, Helping Children Make Transitions Between Activities from Vanderbilt, that's a pretty good one. And then there's Smart Classroom Management and then Behavior in Schools Tools. And those are good. I just tried to give you some that wouldn't be so hard to read through and look at. You can kind of skim through it and see. The other question that was asked was what components must be in a lesson plan and what would be good to have in a lesson plan. Basically, a lesson plan, whatever it is a roadmap. That's all a lesson plan is. It's a roadmap. It's to get you from one point to another. So when you're doing your lessons, what is the first thing you need to know? If you're mapping out a route, you want to go on vacation and you want to map out a route, what do you got to know first? Yeah, where are you going? That's your learning outcome. Where are you going? So how do you find that? How do you know what that learning outcome is? Yeah, it's the standards, right. The standards are going to tell you what it is you need to teach them, what do they need to know. So the standard is your guidepost. You got to have that standard. It has to be in any lesson plan that you write. Okay, so you get a lesson plan standard. Then what do you have to know? If you're looking at the Danielson Framework, and Dr. Smiley, is that what you've got? You got
Yes,
copies
I
of?
did.
Because I have copies right here.
Thank you very much.
So the lesson plan, so you've got your standard. I lost my train of thought for just a minute. You got your standard. What's the next thing you need to know?
What you want to teach.
What you want to teach. So in writing your lesson plan, what's your objectives? What you want to teach, and what's an objective?
What you want the students to do.
Right. So what's the difference? Can anybody tell me what's the difference between a standard and an objective?
standards or things you need to have and objectives or things you want to have them, like the outcome you want?
Right. The objective is your learning outcome. The standard is what the student needs to know. But the objective is the learning outcome. Okay? And there can be different objectives or learning outcomes for the same standard. Just depends on what you're doing, what grade level you're teaching. So you've got your standard, you got your objective, and now we come back to the students. You got to always come back to the students. You can write the best lesson plan there ever was, but if it doesn't address the students in your classroom, it may not be effective. I know a teacher, well, he's retired now, and he was assistant superintendent, but I remember he taught secondary social studies. And when he was leaving the classroom to go to administration, he had this 4-drawer file cabinet. And I had come down to help him move his things into the new office. And so I said, are we going to clean out this file cabinet, or are you just going to bring it with you? And he said, oh, no, I'm going to clean it out. He said, because I'm not going to come back, I won't be coming back to the classroom to teach. So we opened the files, and he had lesson plans for almost all the years he was teaching. And I said, well, what do you want to do with them? He said, I would just throw them away. He said, because I'm done with them. And so I started looking at them, and basically they were the same lesson plans that he had taught from almost the first year he had started, with just not a whole lot of changes. And I thought, you've been teaching for over 20 years and you're using the same lesson plans. You know, it doesn't seem, okay, how effective were they when you had a class in 1978 and now you have a class in 1994? You know, how effective was it? So really and truly, you can look at the same lesson plan, and it might be very similar from one year to the next, but hopefully you'll go back and look at it in terms of the students that you're teaching this year.
I have another story for you. When I was in Oklahoma, I had heard of this legendary teacher who just, the kids worshiped her. I think she was a 4th grade teacher. We had 3 or 4 student teachers in that school. She had put all the lesson plans that she had. I think she'd been there for 8 or 10 years. They were all in 8 grades. Some of the most innovative lesson plans I've ever seen. And she said, tell them they can have any one that they want. I'd redo everything during the summer. I remember thinking, are you kidding? I'd never heard anybody talk. And she was as buoyant. She'd been there for I don't know how long. She was as into teaching as anybody I've seen. And she said, half the fun is being able to do new stuff. Mm-hmm. I could rest on my laurels. I know what people say about me. That means that I don't want to. So that's what I wish for all of you. And she was, I remember I was sad to leave. She let it be known anybody could come in. She said, you can duplicate them, you just have them. I'm going to redo them. The kids loved her. The student teachers thought she was something. The administrators all wanted her to teach in their schools, as opposed to the same lesson plan for 20 years.
Mm-hmm. And I've seen that, and it's not a good thing, because you're not really looking at your students, and you need to know your students. So, okay, so resources, and we talked a little bit about resources. So you need to know the major things is the standards, the objectives. You don't necessarily, not every lesson plan is going to give you a space on the lesson plan to write down information about student backgrounds and levels of development. But you should know that. You should have that. That should be first in your mind as you sit down to write a lesson. Resources, again, knowing what you have and how you're going to use them, that is important. That is a major component of the lesson plan. Every lesson plan that I have ever seen in all of my teaching has a materials spot. Differentiation. How are you going to differentiate to meet the needs of the individual students in your classes? That's not just the 504s and the SPEDs. That's students with any kind of need, for instance, taking into account their differences in their learning styles, maybe differences in their strengths and weaknesses in different subject areas, and how are you going to move them around? What are you going to do? You've got to know, again, you got to know your students before you can even do the plans for differentiation. Now, if it's a SPED 504, a SPED IEP or a 504, the SPED plans you have to take at their word. Whatever they tell you for accommodations, you've got to, by law, do in your classroom. That is a given. You cannot say, well, I'm just not going to do that.
When I first got here, I talked with a teacher who said, I'm not going to do it. And I reminded her that, do you know what 94-142 was? Because in 1975, they're not asking you, it's the law.
Yeah.
And she was bragging. She said, I've gone through 3 principals and X amount of superintendents. I'm not going to do it. And I don't want to touch that with a 10-foot pole.
Yeah. 504s sometimes have plans and sometimes don't have plans. But you as a teacher need to make sure that you do speak with the counselor, speak with the lead teacher, speak with the administrator, so you know those students so that you can accommodate them. Just because they may not have a plan in place, they have needs just like the SPED children, and they need the help. And the one thing about it is SPED is law. 504 is not necessarily, you know, and the advocates, usually with SPED, with SPED you have the opportunity as a parent to request an advocate other than yourself to be in the SPED meetings. 504s don't have that. And the parents are usually the only advocates for those children. And so you need to develop that relationship with children, the parents of children who are 504s, so you can work together to provide those children with what they need. Okay? So differentiation today is important as a component in your lesson plan. You should have something on your lesson plan about differentiation. Accommodations, again, accommodations a lot of times go under differentiation in some lesson plans, but in some lesson plans there's a special place for accommodations so that you list them, so you are reminded of what they are. So differentiation is the major. Accommodations are not necessary in all lesson plans because they fall under differentiation sometimes. Instructional sequence, I think it's called DOL of learning. That is also an important component. I always tell people we go back to the TTW and the TLW, the teacher will and the learner will, and it starts from the very beginning of the lesson and it goes to the very end of the lesson. The teacher will introduce the lesson by doing such and such. And so included in this is your direct instruction, your guided, your anticipatory set, your guided, participatory set, your direct instruction, your guided practice, then your individual practice, and then your closure. And depending on who's teaching it, which way, different things, different vocabulary for different things. So that is, you've got to have that in there, and it's got to be spelled out. You've got to spell that out. So I always tell everybody also that your lesson plan should be written in such a way that if for some reason you weren't in school that day, someone else could pick up that lesson plan and deliver the lesson the way that you wanted it delivered. Okay?
Unless you've been a substitute teacher, you don't know how valuable that is. You walk in and don't have one, and your hands get clammy really quick. My first semester, that's what I did. I substitute taught in high school. I learned more in that semester than I did in 3 years in grade school.
Okay, so then assessment. Of course, you've got to have some kind of assessment. It could be as simple as feedback. It could be as simple as observation, going around and watching students as they move through their practice or whatever. And it could be as in-depth as a test or a project of some kind. Okay, just depending on what you're teaching and where you're going with it. The other thing is your reflection. This is not necessarily on a regular lesson plan that teachers use, but for pre-service teachers, it's important that you have that on there and that it triggers you to remember to do your reflection. How good was that lesson? What could you do better? What happened during the lesson? Just a critique of it. And then for a practicing teacher out in the classroom, you go back over your lesson, think about it. What would you do differently the next time? You might even use a different material than what you used. Or you may decide to include a video, or you may include something on the computer or web or something like that.
May I add something?
Sure.
Mr. McGarrett was here. He said, and I want your thoughts on this also. When you're through the lesson, you ask it. Does anybody remember the two things that he said you should ask students? Any chance? He said you ask them. Go ahead.
One was, what can I do better, or
Well,
what did you like or didn't
Sure.
like?
What did you like most? What one? He said, don't be very honest. He said, no, the other one's going to hurt your feelings a little bit. What do I need to do more of or less of next time? If you can do that without bruising your ego, you'll learn a great deal.
Mm-hmm.
And he
They'll
said-
tell you. They'll
Yeah,
tell
I
you.
know, and he said, when he first started, he said he learned it from somebody and said that was one of the most difficult things he ever had to learn. Everybody wants to tell you how great you are.
Mhm.
But when you say, what about, well, how about this and how about that? We've just about run out of time, and I'd like to ask your permission about something. We were going to try in some of the time to give them a chance to be able to write out some stuff. Can we do that another time?
Well, we had talked about that, and that's what you had said, that we would do it another time. And that's why I wanted to go through this. Before I forget, I think I gave you everything that I had set to give you. Oh, I have one more thing. Let me just get this. Okay, so this has to do with IESA. And this is a rubric for evaluating Indian Ed for all curricula. But in looking at it, I think you can use it as kind of a checklist to see whether or not your lesson plan has the components of what you needed to have. So there, and I'll let you have this.
Thank you very much.
So this basically just kind of says there are 3 types of approaches. There's contributions, there's additive, and there's transformation. And so they give you an idea of what exemplary is with regard to social action. And so as you plan your lessons, you don't want IEFA to become a token lesson. It needs to be something that actually takes in the entire understanding, or the 7 essential understandings, so that you are enriching somebody's knowledge and you're not just doing it to placate a law. Okay, it's important, and this goes across all states, all nations, all ethnic groups. It doesn't matter. Wherever you are in the world, it's important that everyone understands everyone else. And you can't understand someone else's thought processes, background, heritage, whatever you want to say, without actually thinking deeply about it. You know,
I was thinking as you were talking, sometimes teachers mean well, but they'll say, well, it's Native American week. Okay, let's
Yeah.
study Native American. That's just about as efficient as saying.
well, it's the same thing that I ran into down in Mississippi. We have Martin Luther King Day is one day out of the year. Well, then they did Black History Week. Then it became Black History Month. But really and truly, Black history for the people in the South, especially my students, it was every day. I mean, it was their heritage. So why are you just making it into 1 month or 1 day or 1 week out of the year? We should be integrating everything and be proud of everyone's heritage every day. So that may help you, because there's no real evaluation for how well you do in implementing IEFA in a lesson plan. But in looking at trying to figure out a way that I could look at a lesson plan and say to myself, did I do it to the best of my ability or to the way of that I understand IEFA, that curricular rubric helps to look at it and see whether or not you're doing it. Okay?
That day, month, or week, people who meant well would set it up. They didn't realize, you're just being tokenist.
Yeah. So what I thought we might do next time, I know I've done all of the talking and that's not really what you should do, but I thought next time what we might do is just divide up into groups and let you all take a standard, a content standard from Montana. You decide on the content standard, and then you look at the IEFA and try to develop a lesson plan for multicultural. I thought maybe Tara and Radium might want to kind of each be in a group, and then if those people who are in the second semester, we divide you up, and then the people in the first semester, we divide you up so that one group is with Tara, one group is with Radium. Not that you have to be the leaders, but with your understanding of it, as you move through it, you can kind of help everyone, for those that have just started, because they're just starting.
Took the time and trouble to get the classes. I can't remember, what year are you in?
This is my first or
What I
second.
thought. Year
Are
second.
you taking curriculum planning now?
Yes.
So you're in the
Yeah,
first.
Well, yeah, I'm not in the teaching program.
I'm not in the teaching program yet.
So you would be, we would call you level ones, so, yeah. So yes, just so that you could kind of guide, I mean, we'd be here, but just as you work through things, that you could just